Most Reverend Father George Anthony Swami, Archbishop of Madras, Mylapore, the author of the book that we are celebrating today, Father John Alexander, whom I respect and love very much, my good friend and mentor, Endram, other distinguished dignitaries on the dais. I see a lot of fellow Don Boscoites here, or Boscoians here. I also see a lot of Loyalites here, both of which institutions I've attended. The principal, I believe, of Don Bosco is here. I see many others. I don't want to mention names because there are far too many of them. So, Reverend Fathers, Reverend Sisters, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking about the book that Father John Alexander has written. I remember when I was in school at Don Bosco, the day began with what we then called a moral science class. I don't know how many years that continued. At that time, I thought honestly that it was a waste of time. But today, when I think back on my school education, one of the most memorable classes, in retrospect, with hindsight, happens to be that. Because the class spoke about home truths that we need to live with, about bonding, about love, about faith, about truth, about honesty, about being frank, the values that we find increasingly endangered in our day and time. Today, when we speak about love, unfortunately, you find suffixes to which are the first that spring to your mind, like love jihad, or love this, or love that. In other words, the vitiation of a pure concept is what is privileged. And this, I think, is the dilemma, the crisis, the existential crisis, if you like, of the idea of love in our times. This morning I was reading a Malayalam paper. I also read a Malayalam paper partly to be in touch with Malayalam. And the very front of the paper was the image of the Pope Francis. He's in Indonesia, and he was there with the leader, the Muslim cleric of Indonesia, Imam Nasruddin Umar, and Pope Francis. Imam Nasruddin Umar is kissing the Pope's hand, and they are there to inaugurate what's called a tunnel of love, or tunnel of friendship. This is at Indonesia's biggest mosque, and West Asia's biggest mosque apparently, the Istiqlal Mosque. This tunnel connects the Istiqlal Mosque to the Holy Mother Mary Cathedral. And in attendance were other faiths. Islam, of course, was there. As you know, Indonesia is predominantly Islamic, 87% of the population. Christians, who constitute about 10+%, Buddhists, Hindus, among the Christians, both Catholics and Protestants. And the Pope said, that's a lovely turn of phrase, if you like, we speak about seeing light at the end of the tunnel. The Pope stood that idea on its head and said, this is the tunnel towards the light. At a time when our idea about friendship and love is caught in what I might call a tunnel vision, the idea of a tunnel which leads you to light is indeed the wisdom of the time, the wisdom of the moment. I was very struck by this. And it's fortuitous that I get to see this morning and talk about it this evening. Father John Alexander's book is striking for many reasons. It's very difficult to speak about a concept like love because it is a shop-worn term. It can become a cliche very easily. It can become stereotypical very easily. But to find new meaning, to reinvent it, to reimagine it, to make it relevant to our times, that is indeed a very, very difficult task. And I was, in fact, wondering how this book is going to read. I did what's called a speed reading of it, and yet I was engaged. To begin with, it's very eclectic. Eclectic in a very substantive manner. He draws from various authoritative sources, quotes a vast array of not just theologians, but philosophers, thinkers, and brings to each idea of friendship and truth and love a fresh meaning. It's a freshly minted language, if you like, with which he's tackled these ideas which could easily become shop-worn, as I said, or stale in some sense, because the term is used over and over and over again. You have love and love and love and love, right? And then you have loves with suffixes, which are problematic. And therefore, to keep the original sense of the word and to invest it with the meaning which is very, very strongly tied to our times, very significant to our times, is to my mind a daunting task, and Father John Alexander has done it so admirably. He speaks about many things. I'll just touch on a few. Speaks about how depth is being replaced by breadth in our times. We have a sense of height and depth being more important than breadth. But as we know, as we move from the analog into the digital age, breadth is privileged. He quotes Nicholas Carr, the author of The Shallow, where he says, Once I was a scuba diver in the sea of words. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski. This whole replacement of depth with surface, with breadth. One can argue that there's an equivalence between depth and breadth. It's just a long habit of thinking breadth and height is important, that you don't value breadth. Because after all, there's the idea of hypertext, there's the idea of lateral thinking. These are all on the realms of breadth. Even in education, De Bono's idea of education and so on deal a lot with the idea of breadth. Breadth is what the younger generation, and I deal with them a lot these days because of the Asian College of Journalism, they think breadth. They don't think height and depth. The terminology of modern technology is one of breadth. You speak about surfing the net. You don't talk about diving into depths of knowledge in the net or ascending heights of knowledge in the depth. Surfing, scanning, spamming, these terminologies are all off breadth. We talk about the world being flat, although it isn't. And therefore, this is an issue, this is an idea that emerges from this book, a discussion on this. It sets you thinking, is what I was trying to say. Religion, of course. This is strongly religious. Obviously, Father John Alexander is a religious person. I must admit, am not. And yet, you see how his religion is not sectarian, it is not narrow. It is imbued with secular values. First of all, the people, the vast array of people, variety of people he quotes are drawn from different faiths, and perhaps even those who have no faith, I don't know. And there's a misunderstanding that religion, for instance, is something that people of my persuasion, let me say, a Marxist, scorn or scoff. Karl Marx is often quoted as saying religion is the opium of the masses, which is true, he said that. But that is the fag end of a sentence where he says, and this is not known so much, people don't bother to find out, he says, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creatures, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of a soulless condition. It is the opium of the masses. Opium not as drug addiction. Opium is something, it gives you relief from all these agony and pain, which gives you solace, which is anodyne. I don't think you could have expressed religion in better terms than that, coming from someone who is not religious. Because you see its function in a society. Father John Alexander goes on, he talks about the need for solitude, as Reverend Father Archbishop also mentioned. But doesn't say that you need to be always in solitude. It doesn't mean you need to abnegate the joys of life. You must live the life and yet be able to find your soul, to find your centeredness. And that, I think, is a very, very valuable idea that this book offers you. He talks about, there's a beautiful anecdote. There are many such anecdotes of Setu Kumaran, who loves a crow, whom he calls Black Beauty. He's a lover of a bird. For those of you who don't know, there's another lover of a bird sitting here, Enram. He has birds with whom he carries on long conversations, which only the bird and he understands. I have another friend called Paul Sakaria, who is a very well-known writer in Malayalam. He once happened to come to Chennai and he was staying with me somewhere, and we were in a swimming pool. And suddenly I heard him talking and I was wondering what he's doing. He was speaking to the black ants which kept coming into the pool. He'll take them and keep them up and they'll keep coming back. So he's scolding them. He said, how many times will I keep you up there and you keep coming down? Don't I have to swim? And I found it odd. But this is a kind of passion with which you engage with not just people around you, but the smallest of beings, birds, creatures, worms. So this triggered this memory in me. The idea of the Eucharist, of course. It's one of the grandest ideas, I think, in Christianity, where you partake in the blood of Christ, in the flesh of Christ, in the form of bread and wine. So this book has so much, actually. It's not a book I should have read the way I read it. I read it the way I read it because I wanted to be equipped to talk about it this evening. But you have to ponder over the pages. You need stillness of your mind to contemplate the ideas that are presented there page after page. That's what makes this book so different. The book, I think, will have a transformative impact on those who read it. As I said at the beginning, I was skeptical whether anyone could take a term like love and make something new of it, or something different of it, or something more meaningful of it. And Father John Alexander has actually belied my skepticism. It is indeed a book that must be read, I think, particularly by the younger generation, particularly in a society, since I come from the media, where there was this wonderful excerpt from the Bible that was read here of St. Paul to the Corinthians, where he speaks about how there's so much of noise and cymbal and sound of drums and so on, so much so that the message is lost. The core idea or principle of media is what you call a signal to noise ratio. If the noise exceeds the signal, you get nothing. Today, unfortunately, because of the preponderance of, say, forms of social media, I'm not decrying it lock, stock, and barrel, but the way social media is in a freewheeling, vicious kind of spin, there's more noise than signal. And we are all trying to make sense of ourselves. We are all caught in these filter bubbles, in these echo chambers, where we're just listening to each other and being strengthened in our biases and in our prejudices, and not able to see the other. We other the other, instead of trying to reach across to the other. Othering has become a pastime, a preoccupation. We saw the example of Indonesia, where 87% are Muslims, and the Pope's arrival becomes an occasion for interreligious bonding and understanding, bridging. In our country, on the other hand, there's an exceptionalist premise for the majoritarian religion, a refusal to integrate. In fact, a political compulsion to keep the pot boiling, to fragment and communally divide for petty, narrow political reasons. This is where we need the transcending effect, the transcending touch of love. And so I would heartily recommend this book to each and every one of you. I certainly will keep a few copies of this in our library at the ACJ, which Ram, in fact, is a trustee of the trust which runs the college. And I'll end by saying, there's this ditty, if you like, that I read when I was in school, in Don Bosco, in fact. In those days, I used to assiduously read a magazine called Reader's Digest. I don't even know if it exists now. And they would have these nice quotes, quotable quotes below it. And some of those have stuck to my mind for no rhyme or reason. And this one particular one had no author, but it's not mine, therefore I'm just trying to explain. It says, and it seems to be speaking to our times, hate plus hate, but equals hate. Unhappy gain, despairing state. Hate plus love invokes a light, subtracts from hate its darkened might. Don't add at all to hate and strife, for what you add becomes your life. Thank you very much.